The golden afternoon light fell softly across the expansive lawns of Willow Creek Manor, casting long, quiet shadows from the ancient oaks that lined the grand driveway. Nestled in the heart of Napa Valley, California, the estate was a masterpiece of stone architecture and expansive windows, surrounded by rows of neat, sun-drenched vineyards. To any outsider, it looked like the cover of a luxury real estate magazine, complete with a marble staircase and immaculate hedges. But along the western path, away from the grand entrance, lay the white rose bushes that the late mistress of the house had planted with her own hands years ago, before leaving this world far too soon. Arthur Larrabee Valdivieso stepped out of his car without notifying a single soul. A prominent winemaker and owner of the estate and its surrounding vineyards, he was a mature man whom widowerhood had pushed into an endless routine of business travel. That very afternoon, his scheduled corporate luncheon in San Francisco had been canceled at the last minute, and instead of staying at a hotel, he decided to drive the 2 hours back to his country home. He had not called his older sister, Helen, nor had he alerted any of the household staff. He simply felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to return when he saw the highway sign for Napa. Closing the car door with immense care to avoid making noise, he walked toward the side gardens with his navy blue blazer draped over his arm, his shirt sleeves unbuttoned, and his eyes reflecting a deep, quiet exhaustion. And that was when, right before reaching the stone steps, he saw her. She was standing alone in the lateral path of the garden, right beside the white rose beds. He recognized her instantly. She was the executive housekeeper of Willow Creek Manor, Irene Carvajal, a middle-aged woman hired long ago by his late wife. Arthur had passed her in the hallways for years without truly looking at her, offering nothing more than a polite good morning before moving on like a distracted master who confuses presence with attention. But this afternoon, Irene was not the invisible woman of the corridors. Her right hand was pressed tightly against her temple, her knuckles were stark white, and her shoulders were hunched forward as she wept. Arthur stood completely frozen at the base of the stone stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched her chest heave with silent, agonizing sobs. For a fleeting second, Arthur considered stepping backward into the shadows and pretending he had never seen her, which was exactly what a master accustomed to looking away would usually do. It would have been the easiest path, the most comfortable choice, and precisely what he had done for years regarding the small, quiet heartaches that transpired under his roof without his knowledge. But something about the rigid posture of her back stopped him in his tracks, forcing him to realize that this woman was not weeping over some trivial domestic mishap. Irene was crying with the disciplined, heartbreaking dignity of someone who had learned over a lifetime never to make a sound, letting the heavy tears stream down her face without allowing herself a single audible sob. It was the devastating grief of an individual who had made invisibility her primary professional duty, and Arthur, standing on the grounds of his own magnificent estate, felt a sudden, burning wave of shame wash over him. He could not tell how long he remained there watching her. It could have been mere seconds, or long, drawn-out minutes, until she suddenly seemed to sense a presence behind her. She tilted her head slightly and began to turn around, causing Arthur to realize in a fraction of a second that if she caught him spying on her vulnerability, her fragile dignity would shatter into pieces he had no right to break. He quickly stepped back, hiding his tall frame behind the massive stone pillar at the base of the staircase, holding his breath as the wind rustled through the vineyards. Irene wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took 2 deep, centering breaths, adjusted her crisp white apron, and began walking toward the small staff cottage at the rear of the property, without looking back. When she was finally far enough away, Arthur stepped out from behind the pillar and stared at the empty path, realizing with absolute clarity that his house had ceased to be his home a long time ago. Inside the grand house, Helen Larrabee was meticulously adjusting the floral centerpiece in the formal dining room, with the absolute calmness of a woman who controlled every single square inch of her territory. As Arthur's older sister, a woman of frozen elegance and sharp instincts, she had moved into Willow Creek Manor shortly after his wife's passing to help manage the estate, gradually transforming into the true domestic ruler of the property. The entire staff answered directly to her. Every single invoice, domestic order, hiring decision, and sudden resignation passed through her manicured hands before anyone else even heard about it. When she heard the heavy front door click open, she raised her head with the sharp, calculated surprise of someone who absolutely did not expect any visitors until the following afternoon. Arthur entered the grand foyer without his usual greeting, his face pale and his mind visibly preoccupied as he set his briefcase down on the polished hardwood floor. "Arthur, what on earth are you doing here today? I thought your meetings in the city were supposed to keep you occupied until tomorrow evening," Helen said, her voice smooth but searching. "The luncheon was cancelled at the last minute, Helen, so I decided to drive back early," Arthur replied curtly, walking past her into the main parlor. "Well, you really should have called, my dear. The cook has already departed for the evening, and we have absolutely nothing prepared for dinner," she noted, smoothing her silk shawl. "Helen, we need to talk right now," Arthur said, turning to face her with a tone so severe it made her inner thoughts race with sudden apprehension. Helen adjusted the fine fabric over her shoulders with a tiny gesture that betrayed absolutely none of her internal panic, though her mind began to calculate her options at lightning speed. Arthur never arrived without warning, and whenever he used that specific, low tone of voice, it meant some unresolved issue had taken root in his mind. "I am listening, my dear. Did something happen on the road?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I just saw the housekeeper, Irene, crying hysterically in the garden by the white roses," Arthur said flatly, keeping his eyes locked onto his sister's face. Helen let a tiny fraction of a second pass before responding, a pause so microscopic that almost anyone else would have missed it completely. But this time, Arthur noticed the hesitation. "Oh, Irene is simply an incredibly sensitive woman. She has her difficult days, as people of her station often do," Helen replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I spoke to her this afternoon regarding a minor flaw in her service that I was thoroughly dissatisfied with. A complete nothing, really. But you know how these employees are, Arthur. Any constructive feedback is immediately taken as a massive personal insult." "What specific flaw in her service are you talking about, Helen?" Arthur demanded, his voice growing cold. "Arthur, please. Are you truly going to make me cross-examine the minutiae of domestic administration the moment you step off the highway?" Helen laughed elegantly. "Tell me you just had a stressful day, give your only sister a hug, and let us find something in the kitchen to eat together." "I asked you a direct question, Helen. What did you say to her?" Arthur repeated, refusing to back down. Helen held his intense gaze for a long moment before offering the practiced, charming smile of women who had won hundreds of arguments by simply changing the topic with absolute grace. "My dear brother, do not lose your temper with me just because you happened to cross paths with an emotional maid on a Tuesday afternoon," she said softly. "This estate has run perfectly under my guidance for years, and if the housekeeper is dealing with personal dramas, it is simply not our structural responsibility to solve them. If she is becoming too unstable to perform her duties, I can easily terminate her contract tomorrow morning." "No, Helen, you will absolutely not fire her," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave as he moved toward the staircase. "I want to have a quiet evening, and tomorrow morning I am going to speak with Irene myself." "Arthur, domestic matters are my domain," Helen began, but he cut her off immediately. "I said I will speak with her myself tomorrow, Helen. Now, I am going to my study, and I do not wish to be disturbed." As Arthur ascended the stairs toward his private quarters, Helen remained standing in the foyer, her pleasant smile instantly vanishing into a mask of pure fury. She hurried into the side study, pulled her phone from her pocket, and dialed a number with trembling fingers. "Richard, we have a major problem," she whispered urgently into the receiver. "Your uncle returned a day early, and he saw things in the garden that he was never supposed to witness." On the other end of the line, her son, Richard, felt a sudden knot tighten in his stomach. "Mother, what did he see?" he asked. "He saw the housekeeper crying." "We need to accelerate our plans immediately," Helen hissed before hanging up. A few dozen yards away, in the quiet staff cottage at the back of the property, Irene entered her small dining room, with her face still visibly swollen from her tears. She removed her apron, folded it with practiced care over the back of a wooden chair, poured herself a glass of cold water, and drank it, while staring blankly at the wall. From the small bedroom at the end of the short hallway, a sweet, fragile voice called out to her. "Mom, is that you? Are you finally home?" Irene immediately ran her hands over her face, checking to ensure that the physical marks of her grief were not too obvious for a child to notice. She walked into the bedroom, where her 7-year-old daughter, Alana, was sitting on the bed with an open storybook resting on her small lap. When the little girl saw her mother enter, she smiled with the complete, unreserved joy of children who have not yet learned to hide their emotions from the world. "Mom, you are just in time. I was reading the story about the beautiful rose that grew all by itself in the middle of the valley. Do you want me to read it out loud for you?" Alana asked eagerly. Irene sat down on the edge of the mattress, gently smoothing the girl's dark hair away from her forehead. "Maybe later, my sweet girl. For now, tell me all about your day at school," Irene whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mom, why were you crying again today?" Alana asked suddenly, her innocent eyes filled with deep worry. Irene felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked from her lungs, freezing her in place as she looked at her daughter. She did what mothers always do when a child strikes the exact chord that hurts the most, trying to deflect the pain. "Why would you say that, my darling?" "Mommy is perfectly fine," she lied gently. "Because your eyes look exactly the way they did last Tuesday, and the day before that, and the week before that," Alana replied softly, counting the days on her tiny fingers. Irene pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, pressing the little girl against her chest, as she fought back a new wave of tears, completely unsure of how to answer. Alana was only 7 years old, yet she had been silently keeping track of every single time her mother returned to the cottage with red, swollen eyes. "Mom, if Aunt Helen treats you so badly, why don't we just pack our bags and leave this place?" Alana whispered against her shoulder. Irene closed her eyes tightly, the simple question containing a harsh reality that she had been avoiding for years. Before she could formulate a comforting answer, 3 sharp, aggressive knocks echoed through the front door of the cottage. They were not the gentle knocks of old Frank, the landscape gardener, nor were they the polite taps of Alice, the cook. They were the cold knocks of a butler, delivering an official decree, and Irene's heart sank as she stood up. Irene motioned for Alana to remain quietly in her bedroom, walked to the front door with heavy steps, and pulled it open to find the estate's head butler standing on the porch. Matthew was holding a sealed white envelope in his hand, his eyes cast downward toward the wooden floorboards as if he could not bear to look her in the face. "Miss Irene, Miss Helen explicitly ordered me to deliver this directly to your hands tonight, before the day officially ends," Matthew said, his voice barely audible above the rustling wind. Irene took the envelope with fingers that had suddenly stopped trembling, tearing it open right there in front of the butler to read the contents. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an official termination letter, effective the following morning at dawn, with no formal cause listed, bearing Helen's sharp signature. Matthew raised his eyes slightly, and seeing the profound sadness in Irene's face, he decided to disregard his strict professional boundaries for the first time in his career. "Miss Irene, listen to me very carefully. Do not sign a single thing tonight. And absolutely do not leave this cottage tomorrow morning until Mr. Arthur speaks with you," he whispered. "Frank and I saw the master arrive this afternoon without his usual driver. Something is shifting in this house, and Helen knows it, which is why she sent this before he could talk to you." Irene looked at the butler, realizing for the first time that she was not entirely alone in that massive, hostile estate. Irene did not sleep a single wink that night. She remained sitting on the edge of Alana's bed long after the little girl had drifted off to sleep, staring at the termination letter. As the first rays of dawn began to touch the tops of the oak trees, she reached a firm decision. She would not sign the paper, and she would not leave. She dressed Alana early, walking her to the back gate where the school bus always picked her up, the morning air crisp and cold against their skin. "Mom, nothing bad is going to happen today, right?" Alana asked, gripping her mother's apron tightly before stepping onto the bus. "No, my love. Today, something different is going to happen. I will tell you all about it tonight," Irene promised with a reassuring smile. As Irene walked back toward the main path, old Frank, the head gardener, was already kneeling by the white rose bushes with a small spade in his weathered hands. He had worked at Willow Creek Manor since before Arthur inherited the property, having known Arthur's mother and his late wife, Beatrice. "Miss Irene, come over here for a moment, please," Frank called out, without raising his head from the soil. Irene approached him quietly, noticing the intense gravity in his wrinkled face as he worked. "Frank, is something wrong?" she asked softly. "Last night, after Matthew left your cottage, I stayed up watching the main house from the equipment shed," Frank whispered, his eyes scanning the windows. "I saw the light in Mr. Arthur's study burning until nearly 3 in the morning, and Miss Helen's lights were on even later than that. Furthermore, I saw a vehicle arrive before dawn bringing young Richard here. His mother made him drive down from the city in the middle of the night." Irene pressed her hand against her chest as a chill ran down her spine. "Frank, do you know what they are planning?" she asked. The old gardener finally stopped digging, his tired eyes reflecting decades of observed family secrets. "I know many things, Irene, but some secrets have been buried so deep that I wasn't sure if it was my place to exhume them," he said. "The late mistress, Miss Beatrice, kept a small green leather diary where she recorded absolutely everything that happened on this estate. Every transaction, every hiring decision, every private conversation. When she passed away, Helen immediately went through her things, and that diary completely vanished from the house." "What does a missing diary have to do with me, Frank?" Irene asked, her confusion growing. Frank reached into the deep inner pocket of his heavy canvas work jacket and pulled out an object wrapped in a faded piece of cloth. He carefully unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small, green leather notebook with heavily frayed edges and stained pages. Irene felt her pulse accelerate wildly as she stared at the familiar handwriting on the cover. "I found this diary the very day Miss Beatrice passed away. She handed it to me herself that morning, knowing it would be our final conversation," Frank explained. "She told me to guard it with my life, because one day the right person would need what was written inside to save this house. Last night, when I saw Mr. Arthur return completely unannounced, I knew the universe had finally provided the right moment." Irene took the diary with trembling hands, opening the first page to find Beatrice's elegant, precise penmanship detailing the names of the estate staff. Right beside Irene's name, written in dark blue ink, was a sentence that Irene had never seen before in her entire life. "Irene, a sacred promise made. If I am no longer here, this woman will protect this home just as I did. Never let them take it from her." Irene felt her knees grow weak, and Frank gently caught her elbow to steady her. "Read the final pages, Irene. You will understand exactly why Helen wants you gone before the master can speak to you," Frank urged grimly. Irene turned the pages carefully, noticing how Beatrice's handwriting became increasingly tense and erratic toward the very end of the little notebook. The entries ceased to be about menu planning or household inventory. Instead, they transformed into a detailed log of financial anomalies. The final pages contained a precise list of dates, bank routing numbers, and massive monetary transfers that Irene did not fully comprehend, but she recognized them as highly irregular. Besides several of these enormous transactions, written twice with aggressive pressure, was a single name: Helen. Irene closed the diary, wrapping it back in the cloth and pressing it tightly against her chest, as if it were a shield. "Frank, this doesn't belong to me. This needs to go directly to Mr. Arthur as soon as possible," she whispered urgently. "I agree entirely, but Helen will attempt to physically remove you from the property before the master even steps outside today," Frank warned. "Mr. Arthur always walks through these rose bushes early in the morning when he stays here. It's an old habit from when Miss Beatrice was alive. I will keep the diary safe in my pocket, and the moment he arrives at this exact spot, we will place the truth directly into his hands." Irene nodded, handing the cloth bundle back to the gardener before returning to her duties. Meanwhile, in the main kitchen of the manor, Arthur was pouring himself a cup of black coffee, having achieved absolutely no sleep during the agonizingly long night. The haunting image of Irene weeping in the garden had played on a loop in his mind, and his sister's cold words regarding domestic staff had left a bitter taste. He stepped through the side French doors of the dining room, walking slowly along the gravel path toward the white rose beds, breathing in the crisp morning air. A few yards away, Frank noticed his approach and stood up straight, offering a respectful nod as Arthur drew near. "Good morning, Frank. How are the grounds looking today?" Arthur asked, trying to project his usual calm demeanor. The old gardener wiped his hands on his trousers, looked his employer dead in the eye, and spoke with a level of boldness he had never used before. "Mr. Arthur, this estate has had two separate masters for a very long time. One is you, and the other never bothered to ask for your permission," Frank said. Before Arthur could ask him to clarify that striking statement, Frank reached into his jacket, pulled out the green diary wrapped in cloth, and extended it toward him. Arthur received the green leather diary with a heavy heart, standing completely motionless on the path for several minutes, without daring to unwrap the faded cloth. He held it in both hands, staring at it as one looks at an artifact that possesses the terrifying power to alter reality the moment it is opened. Frank remained quietly by his side, resuming his work with the soil to give his employer the necessary emotional space to process the moment. The morning sun was beginning to break through the Napa fog, illuminating the morning dew on the white petals. "Frank, this is her handwriting. This belongs to Beatrice," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of sudden realization. "Yes, Mr. Arthur. She gave it to me on her very last morning in this house," Frank replied softly, without looking up from the rosebush. "She told me to keep it far away from the rest of the family, and she promised that when the time was right, a person would appear who desperately needed the truth hidden inside. I didn't fully understand her words back then, sir, but today, looking at you standing here, I finally comprehend exactly what she meant." Arthur closed his eyes, a profound wave of grief washing over his tired shoulders. "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner, Frank?" Arthur asked, his eyes opening to look at the old servant. "Because on that tragic day, you were not truly present in this house, Mr. Arthur, and Miss Beatrice knew you wouldn't be present for a very long time," Frank answered honestly. "She told me that her husband would take years to truly return to this estate, and that he would only do so when the house itself called out to him. She knew you better than you knew yourself, sir. She anticipated the endless business trips, the hotel dinners, and the decisions you avoided by staying away." Arthur felt tears prickling the corners of his eyes as he carefully unwrapped the cloth, opening the diary to reveal his late wife's beautiful script. He saw the little sketches she used to draw in the margins whenever a particular thought brought her joy. and then his eyes locked onto the entry about Irene. "Frank, what was the promise Beatrice referred to in this entry?" Arthur asked, his chest tightening. "Miss Beatrice was terribly ill for months before she passed, sir. And while you were away on business, someone had to stay in that room with her during the dark hours," Frank explained. "That person was Irene, and she didn't do it for a salary. She did it out of pure love, holding her hand, bathing her feverish forehead, and telling her stories to make her smile. I used to hear their voices through the open window while I worked down here, sir. Miss Beatrice's weak laughter, and Irene's patient, soothing comfort," Frank continued softly. "A few days before she died, Miss Beatrice made Irene promise that as long as she had breath in her body, she would ensure someone loved this house the way she did. Irene made that promise with her hand resting on your wife's hand, and she has kept it every single day since then, despite how Helen treated her." Arthur pressed the diary against his chest, his breathing ragged, as the sheer weight of his own prolonged absence crushed his spirit. "Did Helen know about this promise?" he managed to ask through his grief. "Helen arrived a few weeks after the funeral, sir, and she immediately seized control of everything, locking Miss Beatrice's private bedroom and keeping the key for herself, under the guise of preservation," Frank said. "She has spent the last 6 months attempting to drive Irene out of this house through sheer psychological cruelty, and last night, she finally sent Matthew with a termination letter." Arthur's eyes flashed with a sudden, cold anger. "Frank, take me to my wife's old bedroom right now," he ordered. "The door is padlocked, sir, but Miss Beatrice gave me a duplicate key years ago, telling me to keep it until you explicitly asked for it. You just did." As Arthur and Frank walked toward the lateral entrance of the grand mansion, Helen was pouring fresh coffee in the smaller breakfast parlor across the house. Sitting opposite her, with his elbows propped on the table and his eyes staring vacantly out the window, her son Richard was nervously stirring a cup of tea. He had arrived before dawn, looking thoroughly exhausted, his face reflecting the heavy burden of a young man who had been complicit in secrets for far too long. "Richard, I need you to be completely focused this morning. Your uncle is questioning things he has no business investigating," Helen said, her voice sharp. "Mother, just tell me the truth for once. Why did you force me to drive down here in the middle of the night?" Richard asked, setting his spoon down. "Because Arthur saw the housekeeper crying, and he is going to want to open conversations that do not benefit any of us," Helen explained coldly. "I need you to speak with him before he speaks with me. Tell him that you found me weeping in my room, that I am completely overwhelmed by the domestic accounts, and that Irene has been stealing from the estate. We need to frame her before he uncovers anything else." Richard stared at his mother in absolute horror, his stomach turning. "Mother, do you even hear yourself right now?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and profound disgust. "For the past 6 months, you have been asking me to sign strange corporate documents, to make offshore wire transfers, and to lie about things I never saw. I did it because you are my mother, but today you want me to lie to Uncle Arthur about a woman who comforted Aunt Beatrice until her very last breath." Helen slammed her coffee cup onto the table with a terrifying force, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Your aunt was a simple woman who married into this family by pure luck, Richard. She was absolutely nobody before she took your uncle's name, and that servant only exists in this house because of her," Helen hissed. "I owe absolutely nothing to that dead woman's memory, and neither do you. The only thing you owe is loyalty to the family name that funds your entire lifestyle, and that name survives because I know how to manage our assets." Richard stood up from the table slowly, shaking his head. "I am not going to lie to Uncle Arthur, Mother. If he asks me what I have been signing, I am going to tell him the absolute truth," he said before walking out of the room, leaving Helen alone, her hands shaking with a sudden, terrifying panic. In the western wing of the house, Arthur and Frank arrived outside the heavy oak door of Beatrice's former bedroom, which had remained sealed for years. Just as Frank had warned, a heavy brass padlock had been aggressively installed above the original keyhole, a precaution Helen had claimed was necessary to protect her brother's grief. Frank inserted the old duplicate key into the original lock, but the door refused to budge due to the secondary chain Helen had added. "Frank, go fetch Matthew and tell him to bring the heavy tools from the maintenance shed. We are opening this door today, no matter what," Arthur commanded. The gardener nodded, hurried down the hallway, leaving Arthur alone in the dim corridor, his hand resting against the cold wood of the door. Within minutes, rapid, clicking footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway, and Helen appeared around the corner, her face tight with anger. "Arthur! Frank told me you were up here. What on earth do you think you are doing outside Beatrice's quarters?" she demanded, marching toward him. "I am opening this room, Helen," Arthur said flatly, not moving an inch. "You absolutely cannot do that, Arthur. I had this room sealed to protect your fragile emotional state. Entering now will only destroy the progress you've made," she argued frantically. "I am entering this room right now, Helen," Arthur repeated, his voice dangerously calm as he stared at his sister's pale face. "Arthur, I beg of you to stop this madness. Let us go downstairs and discuss the estate accounts properly. Not like this, not by breaking locks," she pleaded. "Why are you so terrified of me stepping inside this bedroom, Helen? What are you hiding in there?" Arthur asked, stepping closer to her. Helen remained silent for a fraction of a second, her frozen elegance finally cracking, revealing a deep, desperate terror that she could no longer conceal. "Because inside that room, Arthur, there are things your wife left behind that would completely destroy your perception of this family, and I kept it locked to protect you out of sisterly love," she lied aggressively. Arthur looked at her with pure disdain. "You opened this room the day after her funeral, didn't you, Helen? What did you remove from her desk?" he asked. Before she could answer, Matthew and Frank appeared in the corridor, carrying a heavy set of bolt cutters and a toolbox. Arthur extended his hand toward the butler. "Matthew, give me the tools, please. Helen, go to your sitting room. We will have our final conversation shortly." Realizing she had lost control, Helen turned on her heel and fled down the hallway. With a loud metallic snap, the padlock fell to the floor, the key turned, and the door swung open. What Arthur saw inside the locked bedroom of his late wife left him standing completely paralyzed on the threshold, unable to draw air into his lungs. The room was not pristine and untouched as Helen had claimed for years, nor was it destroyed. It was something far more insidious. It had been systematically repurposed into a cold, clinical corporate archive for Helen's private transactions. Beatrice's beautiful handmade quilt still rested on the mattress, and her books were still aligned on the shelf, but her personal photographs, her sewing basket, and the antique music box Arthur had given her for their first anniversary were entirely gone. In their place, lined up perfectly on the elegant vanity, were 4 thick, black corporate binders, labeled with precise white lettering. Arthur stepped into the quiet room, each footstep echoing against the dust of his prolonged absence, while Frank and Matthew remained outside, out of deep respect. He approached the vanity, pulled open the first binder, and found dozens of fraudulent invoices, unapproved land surveys, and massive corporate withdrawals charged directly to the family vineyard's primary accounts, all bearing Helen's signature. The first 3 binders detailed a massive, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme that had been running under his nose for years. He picked up the 4th binder, which bore the initials RLB, Richard Larrabee Beaufort. Opening the final binder, Arthur discovered a meticulous record of monthly wire transfers stretching back 5 years, funneling vast sums of money directly into his nephew's private accounts, authorized entirely by Helen, using forged vineyard credentials. A cold, professional rage began to overtake Arthur's grief, the fury of a businessman who realized his emotional absence had allowed his own blood to rob him blind. He walked over to the bed, lifting the heavy down pillows where Beatriz used to rest her head, and his fingers brushed against something hidden inside the linen casing. He pulled out a small, faded photograph that had been folded into 4 neat squares, carefully smoothing it out beneath the morning light. The photograph depicted 2 women sitting on the edge of that very bed. Beatriz, already visibly frail from her illness, was cradling a tiny baby girl in her lap, while Irene sat beside her, holding Beatriz's arm with a deep, sisterly tenderness. The baby was Alana. Beatriz was smiling with a radiant joy that Arthur hadn't seen in her face for years before she died, and looking at the image, he realized that Irene had given his wife the family she had always despaired of having. Arthur sank onto the edge of the mattress, burying his face in his hands as he finally allowed his tears to fall. Frank and Matthew quietly closed the bedroom door, leaving their employer alone with his ghosts and his grief for a long time. When Arthur finally emerged, his eyes were red, but his posture was absolute granite. He held the 4 corporate binders under his arm, and the photograph pressed against his heart as he marched toward the main kitchen. There, Alice, the head cook, was nervously chopping vegetables when she saw Matthew motion for her to step into the adjoining pantry. "Alice, the master has opened the room. He knows everything," Matthew whispered urgently. The cook pressed her hand to her throat, a profound look of relief washing over her tired features. "Thank God," she whispered, walking over to a high storage cabinet, stepping onto a small stool, and retrieving an old, dented tin cracker box, hidden behind the flour sacks. She brought it down, opened it in front of Arthur, and pulled out a plain, cream-colored notebook labeled Alice's Recipes. But as Arthur turned the pages, he saw that beneath every recipe for apple tart or mushroom risotto, there was a detailed log written in sharp pencil. "This is a record of every private meeting Helen held in this house while you were away, Mr. Arthur," Alice explained firmly. "Every time she ordered a lavish dinner for unannounced real estate developers, every time undocumented crates arrived at the loading dock, and every time she forced me to alter the kitchen invoices, I wrote it down," Alice said, her voice steady. "I couldn't speak up before, sir. I support my disabled sister on my salary, and Helen threatened to ruin my reputation if I ever questioned her authority. But Miss Beatriz taught me years ago to always keep a duplicate record of the household expenses in case anyone ever tried to manipulate the accounts, and I never forgot her advice." Arthur took the notebook, his mind instantly matching Alice's detailed timeline with the fraudulent bank transfers in Helen's binders. They aligned with terrifying, mathematical precision. "Alice, you have given me more evidence in 5 minutes than a forensic audit would have uncovered in a year," Arthur said, pulling out his cell phone. He immediately dialed his chief legal counsel. "Catherine, this is Arthur. I need you and your senior forensic audit team at Willow Creek Manor this afternoon. Bring whoever you need to secure the accounts. It's an emergency. And Catherine, I need you to personally meet with our housekeeper, Irene Carvajal. She is to be treated as a formal witness, and I am providing her with full legal representation at my expense." An hour later, Helen was frantically packing her leather designer handbag in her private sitting room, having already made the desperate decision to finalize an illicit land sale she had been arranging for months. She had been secretly negotiating the unauthorized sale of a prime 100-acre parcel of the vineyard's Commandant land, using a shell corporation she had established via forged cross-authorizations bearing Arthur's signature. If she could close the deal by the end of the week, the missing millions would be permanently obscured by a legitimate real estate transaction. She grabbed her coat, turning toward the door, when the sound of multiple vehicles tearing up the gravel driveway caught her attention. She looked out the window to see 3 dark sedans parking in front of the grand entrance, and out of the first vehicle stepped Catherine, Arthur's formidable corporate attorney, followed by a team of federal investigators. Helen's phone vibrated violently in her hand. It was a text message from her son, Richard. "Mother, Frank told me everything Aunt Beatrice said about Irene before she died. I cannot carry this guilt any longer. I have given Uncle Arthur the digital keys to the offshore accounts. I am so sorry. Richard. Helen stared at the screen, her phone slipping from her fingers as Arthur walked into the room, flanked by investigators. Helen stood frozen as Catherine stepped forward, presenting an official court order freezing all personal and corporate assets tied to the Larrabee estate. Your tenure at Willow Creek Manor is officially over, Helen, Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he held up the green diary and Alice's logbook. The shell corporations have been identified, the wire transfers have been mapped, and your son has already turned over the digital evidence. At the same moment, at the rear cottage, Frank knocked gently on Irene's door. Miss Irene, the master is requesting your presence in the main hall immediately. He explicitly asked that you bring little Alana with you, the old gardener said with a bright smile. Irene felt her heart race with sudden apprehension. Why does he want Alana there, Frank? She asked, smoothing her daughter's school uniform. Because there is a little girl in this house who has been kept in the shadows for far too long, and Mr. Arthur intends to bring her into the light, Frank replied gently. Irene took Alana's small hand in hers, and together they walked along the sunlit path toward the grand stone entrance of the mansion, the little girl looking around wide-eyed. Alana and her mother Irene return to the manor after the truth is uncovered, where Arthur finally recognizes Alana as the child his late wife, Beatrice, deeply loved. Overcome with regret for failing to protect Irene and believing Helen's lies, Arthur promises to make things right. Soon afterward, Eleanor arrives with a sealed legal trust, proving that Beatrice had secured Alana's future and exposing Helen for stealing from those funds to support her son. Faced with undeniable evidence, Arthur orders Helen to leave the estate. The revelations continue when Arthur's long-exiled brother, Thomas, returns, carrying Beatrice's final letter. It reveals that Thomas had been falsely accused decades earlier because Helen fabricated evidence to destroy him. Realizing he had wrongly condemned his own brother, Arthur asks for forgiveness, while Thomas explains that he came back not for wealth but to honor Beatrice's wishes. Helen's decades of deception collapse completely. Her assets are frozen, and she is placed under investigation, while Arthur rewards Irene by appointing her executive director of Willow Creek Manor and welcoming her and Alana into the main house. In the months that follow, justice and reconciliation transform the estate. Helen confesses to years of fraud, Richard cooperates with authorities and begins rehabilitation, and Eleanor passes away peacefully after fulfilling her promise to Beatrice. Thomas is fully restored to the family. Irene manages the manor with compassion and fairness, and Alana brings joy back to the home once overshadowed by lies. The story concludes by emphasizing that a true home is built not on wealth or status, but on kindness, loyalty, honesty, and the courage to protect others, proving that lasting legacy comes from compassion and integrity rather than power.